Well, you used to say the floor will be yours, but that's a bad metaphor. I don't know what will be yours, but you'll have a chance to talk to us about your work. So let me tell you just a little bit about Gil. He teaches at Bar-Ilan University, and I was when he came to Israel from his native Brazil. I always had the same kind of a feeling. I was disappointed he wasn't at Tel Aviv University, and I was thrilled that he was in Israel, knowing full well that he'll be adding much to our field and to students at Bar-Ilan University and other universities and colleagues around the country and around the world. So Gil, when he came and before, held a great promise. And here he is, having not only had the great promise, but the promise, and it remains the promise. And what it is that he's done is actually pretty amazing, given the fact that he's a young man and he's made his mark. For somebody like me, who didn't start in the field yesterday, and I read the literature and talk with people, especially young people, I have the feeling that my field, in a very general sense, is in good hands, and that we don't have to worry about scientific level and passion around the issues that innovate all of us in the field. So above and beyond, Gil has really done some pioneering work. He is a really, and this is not the first time he's heard it, but it's the first time he's heard me say this in public. He is steely-minded. He thinks carefully about his work, and he is a profoundly respectful and decent human being. I am certain he is a wonderful colleague, a wise person, and a wonderful mentor and teacher for the students who learn from him. So thank you, Gil, for all of that and a gazillion other things. And for something which is actually very concrete now, thank you for taking time out. And even what appears now to have been last minute in a way, to tell us about your work, which gets at fundamental aspects of human existence, our understanding of ourselves and our understandings of other people, and the kind of categories that we create, and the kind of feelings and attitudes that we have to people who belong to those categories. Last thing, something to think about. My 4-year-old grandson asked his mother, my daughter, 2 weeks ago, he asked her, why are there nations? Where did that ever come from? He thought they were just people. So why are there nations? What is it? He was asking about a category and how it could be created. Gil, again, thank you very much for joining us and teaching us about the work that you're doing.
Well, Sid, thank you very, very much for that introduction. I'm humbled. And it is a true pleasure to be in here, virtually at least. And probably this is a place that it would be very hard for me to be actually physically. So indeed, there are some advantages to our current very, very problematic situation of the pandemic. But anyway, it is a pleasure to talk to you about this. I'm going to share my screen. And hopefully this is working, right, Sid? You see the
Yeah,
screen. Actually,
fine.
excellent. Okay, so Sid told me I have 45 minutes, so I'm gonna start, and then we'll see where this takes us. But for the past, I don't know, 15 years perhaps, I mean, this has been really the main line of work that I've been working on, having to do really with the conceptual basis of discrimination. And the idea comes from the very simple observation that we have just now heard, that Sid's grandson commented on as well, that we live in a very diverse world. Wherever we are, if it is in Israel, in India, in the United States, in Europe, anywhere in the world, we encounter people from very different kinds. They vary in the languages that they speak, in their beliefs, in their practices, in the way they look, in the way they dress, and so on. And it's often the case that when we, human beings, even children, encounter such a diversity of stimuli in our environment, we tend to try and make a more efficient organization of that information. And the efficient organization of that information is the creation of categories, the creation of groups, so that I don't have to think necessarily about each individual, but rather I can think about them as kinds, as groups. And so we divide the world into social categories. The thing is that not only do we divide the world into social categories, is that something unfortunate often accompanies that creation of social categories, and that is intergroup biases. We tend then to favor people who are like us, and disfavor, even dislike, and even discriminate against and aggress people who are unlike us. I like this particular study that I'm going to show you now, not conducted by me, that it shows how this intergroup bias in empathy is present even at the brain level. And this was a study in which people saw the different faces of individuals, either from their group, so they were white American participants who saw then a woman suffering some kind of painful event, or they saw somebody not from their group, say a Chinese person suffering that same kind of event. And they measured the brain activity in areas associated with our own feelings of pain. And what this study found, and other studies after it as well, is that the same area that is active when we ourselves experience pain is active when we see someone like us experiencing pain, but it's not as active when we see somebody who is unlike us, who belongs to a different group, experiencing pain. In other words, empathy at the brain level, at the neural level, is already biased in favor of those who are like us and versus others who are not like us. And we know that societies also divide the world into us and them, into groups, even physically. So here's one example, and Sid gave away that I'm originally from Brazil. I'm originally from São Paulo, not specifically from this neighborhood, but I think this is a very striking picture that exhibits, that expresses, in a sense, the divides, the physical divides that exist in many societies. And I would assume that in India, just like in Israel, there are such divides, in which you have a wall, a physical wall, separating people of, let's say, one kind from people from another kind. And this place in particular has this horrendous name. It's called the Paraisopolis, as you can see. And as you can imagine, the translation is Paradise City. And you can just think about, for whom is this a paradise? For the people living in the building on the right, or for the people living in the slums on the left. So what interests me are the conceptual foundations of these intergroup biases. That is, what is it in our ways of thinking, in our ways of representing social groups, that gives rise, or at least maintains, facilitates the existence of these intergroup biases, of this discrimination and prejudice and racism, and perhaps even violence? And one particular conceptual apparatus that is likely to be very effective in these functions is what I called, and others called, essentialism. And what essentialism entails is this idea that people, adults, and perhaps children, treat people who belong to different groups, like Jews and Arabs in Israel, as if they are different species of animals. So they are as unlike each other, Jews and Arabs, as elephants and lions are. So let me break that down a little bit. What are some of the components of these essentialist beliefs? One of them is that the categories represent objectively truthful partitions of nature. That is, nobody had to create the term, the concept, elephant and lion. These are natural categories. These are things that exist in the world. And the claim then, or the extension to social categories, is that just like elephants and lions exist in the world, so do Jews and Arabs. And not only Jews and Arabs, but again, in every society, and we'll get back to this later on in the talk, every society will have some kind of social distinction that is treated as if it is, again, truthful of the world. Another component of these essentialist beliefs is that membership in a category is determined by inheritance, and therefore it is fixed. An elephant baby doesn't choose to be an elephant baby, was born like that. And it's unchangeable. It's going to be stable throughout development. A third property of these essentialist beliefs is that categories are thought to be homogeneous, so that everybody in that category is alike. Everybody is the same thing. A lion is a lion is a lion, and arguably then again, by extension to social categories, a Jew is a Jew is a Jew, and a Muslim or an Arab, and so on. And again, I am not an expert in India, but of course, you may have also parallels of, again, these social category systems and these essentialist beliefs in various social categories that exist in Indian society. The fourth and final characteristic of essentialism that I want to mention here is that categories are causally explanatory. What that means is that if I want to understand somebody, what I need the most is information about the category membership of that person. So for instance, if I want to explain the behavior of a man, knowing that he is a man, I can then infer, of course, then he's going to be aggressive and assertive and so on, and athletic and things of that sort. Similarly, if I want to understand the behavior of an Arab in Israel, then I'll say, well, he does what he does because he's an Arab. Not necessarily, again, because he's Ahmed, and Ahmed has particular preferences and particular predilections and habits and so on. So what I've been doing for the past few years is trying to understand whether children already manifest these kinds of essentialist beliefs. So let me tell you a little bit about a few studies, and I'm not going to go into too much detail, but just to give you an idea of how we ask these questions about children and then the conclusions that we can draw from here. So one of the first studies that we did was whether 5-year-olds think categories are objectively true, whether social categories are objectively true. And the way we did this is the following. We showed children triads in which we asked them, for instance, which of the two pictures on top, right, the one on the right and the one on the left, is of the same kind as the one in the bottom. So this is a training trial, actually. And children, 5-year-olds, are very good at this. Of course, they say, well, the one on the right is of the same kind as the one in the bottom. And they say they're both dogs. Very well. What if I told you that there is a place in the world where people think that the animal on the left is actually of the same kind as the one on the bottom? Are they wrong, and should they be corrected? That is this a universal fact about the world that needs to be corrected if you got it wrong? Or is this a cultural decision, a cultural convention that you can do it whichever way you or your culture wants? Again, this is a practice trial. What we were most interested in were social categories. So the same questions were asked about gender. So again, just to give you an example, which one of the two on top are of the same kind as the one in the bottom? And then the child responds, and then we say, well, what if I told you that there is a place in the world where people say that the one on the left is of the same kind as the one in the bottom? Are they wrong, and should they be corrected? Ask the same question for racial categories, for ethnicity, for ethnic categories in Israel, and also for occupational categories. So, doctors and a policewoman. And what we found across ages, that is 5, 8, and 12-year-olds in Israel and in the United States, well, especially in Israel, I would say, is that the category that was treated by children as the most objectively true were ethnic categories. That is, children, 5-year-olds and 8-year-olds, Israeli Jews, thought that if there's a place in the world where people think that Jews and Arabs are of the same kind, they should be corrected more so even than if they think that cats and dogs are of the same kind. So for 5 and 8-year-olds Israeli Jews living in Israel, that categorical division between Jews and Arabs is is objectively true, and it should be corrected. It shouldn't be something that a culture decides to do whichever way they want. What about the second characteristic of essentialism? The characteristic that says that we believe membership in a category is established by birth and not by the environment in which you live. Again, a baby elephant is going to be an elephant no matter if he lives amongst hippopotamus or rhinos and so on. So do children have that same kind of belief about social categories? And again, what social categories? And the way we did this is a technique, a paradigm that others have used also in the past to study these questions exactly, in which we tell children about the little baby, and the baby was born, for instance, to a Jewish man and a Jewish woman. But this Jewish man and Jewish woman, they had to work long hours and they were away from home all the time. So they left this baby to be taken care of by a man and a woman who happened to be Arabs. And they took care and loved this baby. The question then, what will the baby be when he grows up? Will the baby be Jewish as the Jewish man and Jewish woman to whom he was born, or will he be Arab like the woman and man who took care of and loved him? So nature versus nurture. And we ask these same questions for a variety of social categories. So for instance, if one couple is rich and the other one is poor, if one couple is religious and the other couple is not religious, it's a major division in Israel, but also about personality characteristics. So if one couple likes television and the other one likes reading books, or one couple has physical characteristics as well. So one couple is tall and the other couple is short. And what we found is that already by age 5, but also age 8 and even age 12, Jewish Israeli children thought that the social category that is most established by birth is ethnicity. So if a child was born to a Jewish man and a Jewish woman, that child is going to be Jewish. But if that child was born to a poor man and woman and was raised by rich man and woman, that child will be rich. So the environment can alter the social category membership regarding certain social categories, but not regarding ethnicity. The third example, the third characteristic that I want to talk about is whether children treat social categories as homogeneous. That is, they're all the same. And this is a study that was fairly recently published in a collaboration with German colleagues, in which we asked children for their sampling strategies. So what children had to do here, we played a game with them. We said, you want to find out whether Arabs have 12 bones in their hand. So this is just one example of a property. So you want to make a generalization about the group. And to make that generalization, or to examine whether that's true or not, I give you two options. You can check the 3 Arabs on the blue box. So there's one adult, one child, and one elderly man. Or you can check 3 Arabs on the green box, and they are 3 young adults. In the bottom, you see another example, for instance, when we asked about psychological properties. So you want to examine whether Jews prefer cucumber over tomato. So that's a preference. Again, you can check 3 Jews who live in Jerusalem. That's the green box. Or you can check 3 Jews, one who lives in Haifa, one who lives in Jerusalem, and one who lives in Tel Aviv, 3 different cities. And we varied various properties, biological and psychological, various kinds of samples. But the basic idea is this. If I believe a certain social group is homogeneous, then I don't have to go through the trouble of sampling a diverse sample. I only need 1, in a sense, or I need 3 of the same, because they are all the same anyway. So I don't have to travel to Tel Aviv and to Haifa to find out, if they are alike or not, because I assume that they're all alike. And in fact, what we found was both here among Israeli Jewish 5-year-olds and 8-year-olds, and German 5-year-olds and 8-year-olds, Germans, not non-immigrant Germans, believed that out-group members were more homogeneous than in-group members. So Jewish children thought that they could, they selected homogeneous samples more often when questions were about Arabs than when questions about Jews. And German kids also, they chose homogeneous samples more often when questions were about Turks than when they were about Germans. The final piece, or the final characteristic of essentialism that I mentioned, is whether children treat categories as causally explanatory. That is, that if I want to understand the behavior of somebody else, then all I need to know, or what I should be interested in, is the category membership of that person, not necessarily the individual preferences or thoughts of that person. So this is a study that just came out. And this was a study done also with, again, Jewish and Arab children living in Israel, and also German children living in Germany. And this is the way that we constructed the task. So the child was exposed to 3 characters who belonged to a particular group and had a particular preference, a novel preference, a preference that children had never heard about. So this is an example, for instance, for a Jewish sequence. So we told children, this is Dana, she's Jewish, she eats razo. So razo is just a made-up word. You know, we say, yeah, this is one of the things that that adults eat. Then we say, this is Idan, he is Jewish, he eats razo. And this is Alma, she is Jewish, she eats razo. Finally, this is Ayelet, she is Jewish, she eats razo. Why do you think she eats razo? Now, kids being kids, they could answer all kinds of things, right? This is an open question, so they could say, well, she eats razo because it's yellow. Of course, that's an irrelevant answer. We're not interested in that kind of answer, but we were interested in 2 types of answers. One is, why do you think Ayelet eats razo? Because she's Jewish. That is, explaining the behavior of Ayelet by referring to her group membership. A second type of explanation that we could get, and we did get a lot, of course, is that why do you think Ayelet eats razo? Because she likes it. It's a personal preference. It's not a group preference, it's a personal preference. And as I mentioned, children saw these kinds of questions, and again, various kinds of questions like this, both about their in-group and about their out-group. So Jewish children, for the Jewish children, this is an example of an in-group trial. And of course, for the Arab children, this is an example of an out-group trial. And there was, of course, questions about Arabs as well in Israel, and then Germans and Turks in Germany. And the main finding here is that children gave more group responses to why do you think she eats razo for out-groups than for in-groups, and they gave more individual responses for in-groups than for out-groups. Again, this was found across ages and across countries, with some small differences that I won't go into the details now, but I can tell you more later. So, to summarize this first part of the talk, I listed 4 characteristics of essentialism, and what we find is that by age 5 already, children manifest all these characteristics of essentialism regarding a particular social category. In particular, again, in Israel, they manifest all these 4 characteristics of essentialist thinking in regard to ethnic categories, the difference between Jews and Arabs. And the question, or one of the questions, at least, by the way, Sid, I don't know what the protocol is here, but if people have clarification questions while I'm talking, then of course they're welcome to ask. But perhaps more major questions we can leave for later on. But just to open that here. So one of the questions that these findings, and again, many other findings raise, is whether children learn to become essentialists, or are they so instinctively? I don't know how many 5-year-olds you have seen in your lives or in recent days, weeks, months, or so on, but they're fairly smart individuals. So it is a potential that they have already learned to become essentialists by absorbing some messages from their culture, from their society, from their parents, from their kindergartens, or whatever. They, of course, know language, they speak, they interact, they hear. So perhaps they have learned to become essentialists about particular social categories. An alternative is that actually children may be promiscuously essentialists from the beginning. That is, they do have this essentialist predisposition towards social categories. And what society does perhaps is channel these essentialist beliefs towards particular categories, the categories that are most relevant in the children's cultural environment. So one way we decided to ask this, to assess this question, is by looking at children who live in very different environments in Israel. Israel, unfortunately, is a very segregated society in terms of ethnicity. Jews and Arabs mostly live in separate cities or separate neighborhoods. They go to separate schools, to separate kindergartens. There are separate public systems of education, one Jewish, one Arab. Actually, there's more than one for the Jews, but there's one for the Arabs. And so they interact, children especially, they interact very little. But there are islands. And one island is a particular organization called Hand in Hand that runs a few, really not a whole lot, a handful, maybe 5 or 6 educational institutions in which Jews and Arabs study together completely. Ideologically also, they are exposed to the customs and to the language of each other. They have 2 teachers, one Jewish and one Arab, one who speaks Hebrew, the other one who speaks Arab. So very, very really integrated settings. And beyond the question of how does that affect children's essentialist beliefs, and just in brief, I'll say it does. And I can say more about that later on. I mean, of course, it lowers very much the essentialist beliefs. I'm presenting this question here, or this study here, to try and answer the question posed here in this slide. That is, do children, all children, start off very essentialists, and then that lowers for a certain group of children with a particular exposure? Or do all children start very non-essentialists? Well, here it is. So if essentialism is learned, then what we would expect is that, I hope you can see here my cursor, you would expect children in kindergarten, 5-year-olds, to be not essentialists at all. And then those who go to the integrated schools, they will stay non-essentialists. But those who go to the regular system, again, the segregated system, Jews here, Arabs there, they will become essentialists. That's one option. This is, again, an hypothetical developmental prediction. In turn, if essentialism is instinctive, then we might expect all children to start off, again, in kindergarten, when they are 5 years of age. We may expect them to be very much essentialists. Those who go to the regular system, again, the segregated system, they will maintain that level of essentialism. And those who go to the integrated schools become less essentialists as they grow. You can place your bets now. You don't have to put the money out, but what pattern do you think we found? So again, so what we did then is ask these children going to these different systems, Jews and Arabs going to the segregated system, Jews and Arabs going to the integrated systems, a variety of questions tapping their essentialist beliefs about Jews and Arabs. Here's one example. How different are Jews and Arabs in how they think, behave, what they like? Are they very, very different, or are they not different at all? We asked even about how different are Jews and Arabs in what they have inside their bodies, their blood, their brain. Are they very different, or are they the same? Again, this is tapping their biological beliefs about whether Jews and Arabs are really different species, as I mentioned in the beginning. And here are actual findings regarding this question, but this pattern was replicated regarding almost all questions that we asked children on their essentialist beliefs. Again, this is the same kind of graph that you saw before, and here is the pattern. So a few things to note about this pattern. First, let me start with this positive point, and that I mentioned briefly before. At 6th grade, what we see is it's a significant difference between children attending the integrated schools and children attending the regular schools, such that children in the integrated schools, both Jews and Arabs, are less essentialists about ethnicity than their age mates attending the regular schools, both Jews and Arabs. So the educational system, this integration, did indeed lessen their essentialist beliefs about ethnicity. The other point that I want to point out here, and this again goes to that big question that I asked in the beginning, has to do with the beginning. And what we see in the beginning, what we see at the youngest age that we tested, the kindergartners, the 5-year-olds, is that the children attending the integrated kindergartens and attending the segregated kindergartens, A, are essentialists to the same extent, and B, are very essentialists. And that is very significant, especially also, I mean, if you understand a little bit the context of Israel and the context of who are the parents who send their children to integrated kindergartens in Israel, both Jews and Arabs, perhaps especially Jews. The parents who send their children to integrated kindergartens in Israel are parents who, for 5 years, probably, if anything, have been telling their children about the fact that Jews and Arabs are alike. We're all human beings, we all have rights, we're all equal, and so on. Messages of tolerance, messages, again, of equality. These messages, by age 5, apparently haven't sunk in completely. The 5-year-olds who enter these kindergartens are just as essentialists about the difference between Jews and Arabs as are the 5-year-olds who eventually enter kindergartens in these segregated cities and segregated kindergartens. And it's this finding, in one sense, that reinforces this conclusion or this belief that I have that essentialism may indeed be an instinctive bias, and that the environment, the social, educational, parental environment, eventually can lower it, can teach the children away from essentialist thinking. A question that, for me as a developmental psychologist, of course, interests is, where does this bias come from? Where does essentialism come from? Where does essentialism about social groups? You can even say, where does intergroup biases in attitudes and discrimination come from? And for that, I turn to even younger human creatures, infants, 1-year-olds, 10-month-olds. And the reason I turn to them is because I then turn to theoretical ideas of why we form social categories to begin with. Social psychology, that is, psychologists who study adults and social phenomena, have many proposals about why we form social categories. Proposals that have to do with social identity, proposals that have to do with the maintenance of dominance hierarchies, of course, mostly by dominant social groups, want to maintain the social order and say, no, we have privileges because we are essentially different from you who do not have the privileges. Arguments about system justification, again, this is just, again, a cognitive mechanism to alleviate the anxiety of living perhaps in a system that is unstable. So we say, no, 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 everything is in order, this is how it should be, and so on. But the problem I see with these theories is that they require some sophisticated conceptual machinery to explain how even children have these biases, and perhaps even how infants have these biases. Children have to understand something about the system. Children have to understand something about dominance, about social identity. And I'm not sure that young children have already these capacities. And for sure, I know that infants do not have this understanding. So I need to go somewhere else, to some other source for understanding why we form social categories. And here I go to evolutionary psychology. And evolutionary psychologists suggest that one of the main reasons why we form social categories is to differentiate between perhaps even arbitrarily determined friends, those who can help me, and foes, those who can hurt me. To specify just a little more, we can say that there are these two basic needs for survival. And these are needs that were critical for the survival of humans forever. One need is this competitive or perhaps even conflictive need. And that is the need to distance yourself from others who might hurt you, who might harm you, who might compete with you. So you need to recognize who are the people who are unlike you. Who is the outgroup? Who are the people who, again, may hurt you? The other need is a collaborative need, is an affiliative need. You need also to associate yourself with others who might help you, protect you, nurture you, teach you, feed you, and so on. So these are these very two distinct, again, evolutionary motivators of social categorization, and arguably, they may be present even in infants. And if they're present in infants, then we may see what we may call sort of these different conceptualizations of in and out groups. The in group is viewed or should be viewed as composed of a heterogeneous bunch of unique individuals. They each have their unique characteristics. And if I want to understand why Moshe behaves in a certain way, then I have to understand Moshe. I have to ask him. I have to, again, figure out what is his individual preferences and so on. The outgroup, however, the other, I can treat as a homogeneous bunch. They're all exemplars of that category. I have little interest in them as individuals. I treat them, again, as this category. And if I want to explain their behavior, I explain in terms of their category membership. So if, again, these evolutionary needs are present or are driving the development of social categories, then we may see such a different conceptualizations even of in-groups and out-groups already in infants. Do we? So I'm going to tell you these two studies, and these are the last two studies I'm going to present here. I'm going to present them in just a little bit more detail. First, because they're newer, they haven't been published yet. The other ones are published, so you can see the references, you can look for the references. These haven't been published. And in general, I mean, I think studying social groups in infants may seem like, whoa, how can you do that? So here's how we did it. This is a study, again, in progress, in which we are testing 18-month-olds. And the way we do is we adopt a method that has been used recently to establish arbitrary groups among infants. That is, as I said before, an infant, and I'll say about that more. I mean, an infant doesn't know that he's a Jew. An 18-month-old, a 1.5-year-old doesn't know that he's a Jew. He doesn't even know that he's white or black, or definitely he doesn't know also if he's a Brahmin or a Dalit. So we have to establish group membership, a feeling that you belong to a particular group. And the way that we did this, and again, others in the world have done similar things, is we bring the infant to the lab, and we give the infant two choices. One, we tell them, choose one of these two aprons. There's a green one and there's a yellow one. Which one do you like? And we present the two aprons to the child, to the infant. The infant, let's say, picks the yellow. And so we put them on, and okay, great. You know, you're in the yellow team. You know, you have a yellow apron. And we ask them a second question also. Look, now there are these two foods, and we present the foods on bowls. Which one of these two do you want? Do you want the green peas, or do you want the crackers? And let's assume that the infant chooses the crackers. So for that matter, for that particular infant that I just described, people who were yellow and people who like crackers over green peas are people like me. People who wear green and people who like green peas are not like me. Okay, so yellow is my in group, green is my out group. And then we present to these infants a sequence of 4 women, all dressed in the same way and all manifesting the same food preference. So let's say that this is an infant, and I'm going to change the example that I gave before. This is an infant, or the infant here sitting on that you see on the left. She liked yellow and she liked green peas. So now she's going to see, and we assign her to the in-group condition. So what she sees now is these 4 women. I don't know if you can see here in the background, they're all sitting in the back here, the 4 women. They all have yellow folders and they're all looking at the folders and so on. So it's all yellowy and they're together, they're a group. And each one of them then steps up to this table in which there are these two bowls, the same bowls that the infant had to choose from. And she manifests the same food preference as the infant had. So she tastes the green peas and she says, I like it. And then she tastes the crackers and says, I don't like this, and returns and goes back to her seat. Then a second woman steps up again. This is the infant in looking at the video of these women. So the 4 women manifest exactly the same preference as the infant. So again, this is a condition in which infants are exposed to people like him or her. So this is the in-group condition. In the out-group, we can just turn around. Let's assume that the infant here being shown actually liked the green apron and liked crackers. So for that infant, these women are the out-group. So it's very nicely counterbalanced. So after the infant sees the sequence of events, okay, yellow people are like me, they now see 3 of these women stepping up to the table and now choosing one of 2 novel objects. So I don't know if you can see, I mean, I can't even recognize what these objects are. You know, we bought them somewhere and I don't know what they are. But what matters here is that each of these women, 3 women from that group, step up and they each select the same novel object. So she steps up and she picks the object on the right and says, oh, I like this one. She looks at the other one, I don't like this one. And then the second girl does the same thing, and then the third woman does the same thing. Finally, the infant sees the 4th member of that group manifesting an inconsistent preference. She violates the group preference. She prefers, you see, the wooden brown object rather than, I don't know, the thing that looks like a rabbit head. And what we measure now is how long does the infant look at this 4th group member violating the group preference. The hypothesis is that if infants have an expectation that the out group is more homogeneous than the in group, that is, that the out group behaves the same way or more alike than the in group, then they should be more surprised when an out group member violates the group preference than when an in group member violates the in group preference. And what that means is that they should look longer when an out group member picks an inconsistent object than when an in-group member picks an inconsistent object. And that's exactly what we're finding. So this is the looking time in seconds, in milliseconds, in fact. And as you can see, they're looking a lot more when an out-group violates than when an in-group violates. So infants expect out-group members more than in-group members to act alike. We see that even 18-month-olds so have this expectation of out-groups being more homogeneous than in-groups. I'll run through this one. Well, actually, I can't run through this one. But anyway, so this is a study that we did to ask the second question, which is, are infants more likely to individuate in-group than out-group members? And this is a study with 12-month-olds or even slightly younger. And the procedure starts the same way as the other one. So we establish the group preference. Now,
Gil,
yes.
Gil, what do you mean by individuate?
Oh, you'll see now. I think that will be clear once I show the procedure.
Okay.
So yeah, I think. So the infant now sees again. So these are 2 women. Actually, these are not 4 women, but these are 2 women shown twice. Again, manifesting the same preference as the infant or not. So let's again assume that yellow woman is the same as me. Green woman is not the same as me. Then the infant sees the following, as then you can see. They're going to see either one woman in the same condition or 2 different women in the different condition appearing from behind the curtain. So this is what the infant sees. A woman comes out from behind the curtain. She goes back behind the curtain. Again, this is a video. By the way, we have an eye tracker. So this is how we capture looking time from the infant. And the same woman appears on the other side. Okay? Now, here's what happens in the different condition. a woman comes out from that side, but if you have been paying attention, this is a different woman from the woman in the same condition. She goes back behind the curtain, and a different woman comes out from the other side. So back to your question, Sid, what do I mean by individuation? What I mean is, do infants notice that in the different condition, there are two different individuals coming out from behind the curtain? In the same condition, there's only one individual, but in the different condition, there are two different individuals coming from behind the curtain. Or whether the infant says, oh, there's a yellow thing, a yellow person coming from behind the curtain. And again, there's always one yellow person coming from behind the curtain. And the hypothesis was that if infants believe there are two different individuals in the different condition coming from behind the curtain, then if that curtain opens and there's only one person there, I should be surprised because I expected two. I should look longer if there's only one person behind the curtain. And the hypothesis was that if infants are more motivated, disposed, capable of individuating in-group members than out-group members, then now infants should look longer if these yellow women belong to the infant's group than if these yellow women belong to the infant's out-group. They're not like the infant. So what the infant now sees in the test phase is exactly this. A curtain opens up and there's only one woman. Do infants look longer at this when these women are from the in-group than when these women are from the infant's out-group? So this is the same condition. There's only one woman, so that's an interesting, and this is in the different condition. And indeed, this is a significant difference in the looking time of infants in the in-group than in the out-group condition. For the sake of time, and see, tell me if I'm wrong, but I think I'm going to run through this and just go through this. Yes. So again, what drives group cognition? We talked about these two needs, one being a conflict to distance yourselves from others who might harm us. And the inference then is that the target of the categorization, if that's the need governing social categorization, is the other, no matter which one. So you categorize the other. But if the need is an affiliative need, is a collaborative need, in which you need to associate yourself with others who might help you, then you need to individuate. And the claim then is, and I hope you managed to get it from the presentation, is that the second need may be the most important need, the most basic need. And we have evidence for that. For instance, we know that in-group love, that is positive associations regarding the in-group, predate in development out-group hate. We have evidence that behaviorally priming affiliation lessens racial categorization in infants. And we even have some physiological data showing that physiologically triggering affiliation by boosting the level of oxytocin in their blood, in their saliva, sorry, lessens racial categorization also in infants. So this brings me to sort of a general conclusion. It's a question that I'm often asked. Are we born racist? Are we born to discriminate? That is, are infants predisposed to discriminate, and is that inevitable? And I'm going to give three answers that basically reinforce this claim. No and no. We're not born racist, and discrimination is not inevitable. It can be avoided. Why? Well, here's one reason, and I say it's a cheap reason, but I think it's an important one to keep in mind. And the reason is that we have self-regulation. Even if we have natural instinctive drives that evolution has built into us, for instance, you see a sugary thing, high caloric thing, don't eat it immediately. We have that capacity, and we can apply that in a variety of contexts. So even if, again, evolution has prepared us to discriminate between groups, we can resist it. And that goes also sort of with this somewhat of a cliche, but it's an important point to keep in mind, that not everything that is a natural disposition is necessarily morally good nowadays. What was good for our ancestors thousands and perhaps millions of years ago is not necessarily good for us now. Our ancestors didn't live in multicultural societies. Our ancestors lived in very small enclosed groups distant from many other groups. We are in a completely different reality, and we have to therefore engage other systems, other mechanisms to dampen whatever natural dispositions we may have regarding social groups. Which brings me to the other point, and that is that we have culture, which again serves as a regulator. But what I mean also by culture is of many other things. First, the kinds of social categories that we have now developed in our world are varied. They're all, or most of them, are social creations. The distinction between even blacks and whites is a social creation. Notice the fact that in many cultures this is not done, or this is done differently, and the criteria for deciding whether someone is black or someone is white is not something that is determined by objective measures. It's something that the society decided. That the society decided that Barack Obama is black. There's nothing about him that makes him black. Same goes for Jews and Arabs. Same goes for Brahmins and Dalits and the caste system, probably in India. Again, I'm not an expert. But again, you can say that this is true about all kinds of arbitrary divisions between, blue-wearing women and red-wearing women. The point from a developmental perspective is that no infant, as I mentioned before, is born knowing whether he or she belongs to a particular group, and even knows what are the groups that are relevant in his or her society. All of that he and she needs to learn from their society. Think about it. I mean, even again, well, I mentioned this, where's the distinction between a black and a white, and how do we make that distinction? And the claim is that one of the main ways in which we make these distinctions is via language. We tell children the divisions. We tell them that there exist blacks and whites. In Brazil, they tell that there exist blacks, whites, and mulattoes. So all of a sudden, you have a third category that the child now has to figure out, okay, so how do I divide the world? In Israel, they're told that there are Jews and Arabs, and even among Jews, there are religious Jews, secular Jews, Orthodox Jews, and so on. In every society, a child raising in a society is going to receive these messages from the language, and once they have the language, they try to map the words onto actual categories in the world. The third reason why I think, so let me just bring it back here for a second. If we accept this idea that the categories are built, that the categories are constructed, that they can also be revised. If they're constructed via language, they may be also revised via language. They're flexible. They're not built in. The child is not born with a concept of race. And therefore, societies can decide to create, redefine the group boundaries in many ways, and by doing that, create new social group identities. And that has been already proven both with adults and nowadays also with children. And we have also some recent data in Israel showing that if you create a new common identity, you can lessen these intergroup biases substantially. So that's definitely, again, one mechanism that we have available, I mean society, to correct, again, these potential intergroup biases, and definitely, again, the dangerous and harmful consequences of these divisions. The third reason why I say also that discrimination is avoidable and that we're not born racist, again, I mentioned it, is that I believe that affiliation may be the strongest motivator for forming groups. It's not competition, it's not conflict that is the strongest motivator for forming groups. It's not the fear of the other. It is the need to find out who I can trust, who I can collaborate with, who is going to help me. That's the main need. And if that's the main need, and take what I said just before together, then you can say that once you create a new group that is defined by these common goals, these collaborative goals, these goals that unite rather than divide people, you can actually, again, lessen or even perhaps erase the internal divisions that exist. Now, as in the words of John Lennon, you may say I'm a dreamer, but here's an example of something that we do almost every day. I'm a big sports fan, so I checked what is one of the biggest sports rivalry in India, and I understand that this is between these two cricket teams, and I'm afraid I don't know them, but anyway. But in every society, we have some division in terms of sports, in which we have fans of one team. And I don't know how, again, the cricket rivalry is in India, but I do know of football rivalries in my home country, for instance, in Brazil and in many other places in the world. Fans of each team hate each other. And fans of each team have all these kinds of stereotypes and even perhaps essentialist beliefs about the other team. But give them a common goal. Give them a cricket match between India and Pakistan. And all of a sudden, these rival fans are hugging each other, are embracing each other, are chanting together, and are not hating each other just like that. So defining, again, a novel group, a common identity with a common goal can, at least momentarily, and at least in a context-specific way, decrease tremendously these intergroup biases and attitudes. So with that positive message, I end. I thank all my collaborators. Again, a big group led by Hannes Rakoczy at the University of Göttingen, Andrew Barron and Kylie Ham at UBC, Marjorie Rhodes, Susan Gelman, my Bar-Ilan lab, all my students, and all these various funding agencies who helped fund this work. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Dr. Diesendruck. This is Diesendruck. I'm sorry, I don't know how to say it right. This was really interesting.
Thank you.
Sid, do you want to start, or should we go on to opening up to everybody?
I'll just ask one question, but I'll make a quick comment. So my 4-year-old grandson, who asked why there are different countries, so he knows there are different countries, and basically he maybe thinks of the world, thought of the world as being with human beings who are homogeneous, and he was looking for group boundaries. Why would there ever be group boundaries? I think that was at the heart of what it was that he was asking his mother, my daughter. Here's a question for you. Social scientists have studied meetings between in and out groups, or groups that are at loggerheads and with conflicts. So in Israel, it could be Jews and Muslims. It could be anything, blacks and whites, mulattoes and blacks, and etc. in different countries. What I remember from the research literature is that rather than bringing these people closer to each other and understanding the group differences, understanding the commonalities that we share, even though we are in these different groups, what I remember from the research is that often people's stereotypes became more entrenched. They became deeper. So the Arabs, when they were with the Jews, had more conviction about their stereotypes about the Jews and vice versa. So I was wondering how that fits with what it was that you were talking about when you mentioned what happens when Jewish kids and Arab kids are studying together. and how some of the stereotypes melted away. And thank you for an absolutely sterling talk.
Thank you. So let me answer this in the following way. First, you are absolutely right. I mean, there's a lot of research on what's called intergroup contact and the effect that it may have on adults and children in terms of stereotypes, attitudes, and so on. And one of the conclusions, and it's a complicated conclusion, I suppose, from all that work, is that you need very unique conditions for intergroup contact to actually have the positive effects that we would like it to have. Because as you noticed, I mean, it can go the other way. I mean, it can backfire. I don't know how strongly backfire, but it may not work. And in that sense, I mean, I think that the schools and the kindergartens that I studied in Israel, I think are those kind of unique, successful environments in these regards. And I can see why. I mean, you know, again, the integration is really at a completely equal level. They're all equal partners in everything. They are exposed to both cultures in exactly the same ways, to the same extent, and so on. And there is an interesting phenomenon there, and I think it also ties into one of the aspects of your question, Sid, and that is, we got this sort of somewhat surprising finding, which was one of the questions that we asked children. We played this game with children that basically measured how salient for them is ethnic identity. So the game is, I don't know if, I suppose you have this game also in India. It's a very famous game for children. You know, it's the Guess Who game. So I have a bunch of cards of individuals, of faces, and I pick one of them, and you have to guess what card I have by asking me yes or no questions. So you can ask me, is it a boy or a girl? I say it's a boy. So okay, so you drop all the girls and you keep the boys, and you can ask me, does he have glasses? And I say yes, and you drop everybody who doesn't have glasses, and so on. So you ask me yes or no questions. So we created a game like this in which you had also Jewish and Arab characters. So one of the questions that you as a participant, or the child as a participant, could ask is the person that you have in your card, is he a Jew or an Arab? Well, it turned out that the people, the kids, the participants who asked that question the most were the Jewish kids attending the integrated schools. I repeat, the Jewish kids attending the integrated schools, not the Jewish kids attending the segregated schools. That is, for them, ethnicity was very salient. But at the same time, they were the least essentialists about ethnicity. So the environment made ethnicity very salient. Now they know the existence of Jews and Arabs, and they also know what's the difference between Jews and Arabs. So yes, so Jews speak Hebrew at home, Arabs speak Arabic at home. Jews celebrate Hanukkah, Arabs celebrate Ramadan or whatever, Muslims at least, you know, Ramadan, and the Christian Arabs, they celebrate Christmas, and so on. So they had knowledge, not necessarily stereotypes, but anyway, so they had knowledge about the other groups. They now had more knowledge about the other group, but that knowledge was not grounded on essentialist beliefs. They didn't think that this is something inevitable. They just understood that this is something that they do at home, that these are their cultural practices. And this is, again, sort of a very important message, right, about multiculturalism. Multiculturalism, the ideal is not the denial of unique social identities. It's not erasing all nations necessarily. I think that's unfeasible and maybe perhaps even unwanted. What is necessary, though, is understanding what are the foundations for these differences. And these are cultural differences. These have to do, again, with what do you learn, where do you live, and things of that sort, and nothing, again, inherent in you. So you can have these distinctions, but understand that the distinctions are not essentialized. Any more questions or?
Bhavani Chechi?
Yeah, thank you. That was a wonderful talk, and it's really insightful. So actually, I have a couple of questions, and one of the questions actually is kind of related to what you just said at the very end. In India, we have a lot of diversity. It's like ridiculous amount of diversity, but we never try to homogenize anything. We believe in coexistence, and I think that's the strength that we have, and it's something that you actually really flaunt, is the diversity that's there in India, and you touched upon that while answering Sid's question. So yeah, that was one of the things that I had in mind. But I had a question. If you wouldn't mind putting up the slide where you had the affiliation versus conflict, about fear and distance, and there's one particular slide that you had up. I just quickly introduce myself. I'm Bhavani. I work very closely with Sid on multiple projects and here at AMMACHI Labs. Yes, this is the one. Okay. Yeah, so it says need one is conflict with foes, and we need to distance ourselves from others who might want to harm us. And then affiliation is we need to associate ourselves with others who might help us. So I just had a thought about this, and I guess that you're proposing that that the motivations are either conflict, and the other motivation is affiliation, the need to be. But somehow I have a question. If it's, see, power in your paper, you talk about power, and I really believe that power is this huge motivator, because you see that in gender-based things all the time, that it almost always boils down to power. And even in socioeconomic divides, it's often to do with power. So if power is a motivator, and I would think then the power would lead to closeness. You need somebody to dominate over, and you need to basically rule over somebody. So you'd want them around. And I think fear would be the distancer. It maybe fear would be the reason you may want to associate people close to you, but it's also the reason why you want to distance somebody else away. So fear would be both lead to affiliation as well as distance, and power would be you get yourself in a group to basically dominate over another group, and their distance doesn't help. If you need to have somebody to dominate over, so you will actually keep those people closer to you. It's just something that I was mulling over, and I was not quite sure how I could put those. So this need to distance ourselves from those who might want to harm us seems to be closer to the need to affiliate with our friends. But it doesn't necessarily address the power thing that you had talked about in your paper that you sent for us to read.
Yeah.
This was something that I was not quite sure, and I wanted your thoughts on it. And then I have another question, but I can ask that after.
Yeah. Let me see if I can. I hear myself. Okay. I base myself a lot on these notions of what our ancestral environment might have looked like. That is the environment of humanoids in back in the savannas, I don't know, 70, 80, 100,000 years ago. And the idea that we lived in fairly isolated groups for many, thousands of years. Perhaps millions of, again, going back to our sort of animal ancestry in a sense. So dominance there, I think, was played out more at an inter-individual level than at an intergroup level. So you had the dominant male, for instance, the dominant male chimpanzee trying to establish and trying to maintain his power in order to have, privileged access to all kinds of resources, food and females primarily. So I think that the extension of dominance to the intergroup context may be a more modern thing, in which developed once we started actually sort of to living close enough to each other that we needed to form these hierarchies of. So but again, this is definitely an area that I'm a lot less sort of convinced of and less adamant about than the other parts. So basically, these two needs, I mean, I think these are needs that seem the most appropriate, again, for this ancient environment in which you had these isolated groups that sometimes got in touch with each other, and then you had to find out, you know, what you do about this other group. And usually, again, what you had to do is to compete. And again, going back even to animals and to chimpanzees and to sort of bands of chimpanzees trying to get into another's territory, and then, you know, huge fights going on. And this other need of affiliating, which was done more at an individual level, perhaps even sort of a familial level, that you had to decide, almost using sort of your psychological capacities, who you can trust and who you can count on to protect you, to feed you, to teach you, and so on. So maybe it's
but
not
it sounds like you're typically describing an in-group and not between groups. But I thought the whole thing was about society and social groups, and so you would automatically, because if you're talking about individuals, then it's about within one group, right? There's no other, so to speak. It's me, and then there's another person, but that's not a group. But you're studying groups, right?
Yes.
So there has to be an in-group and has to be an out-group somehow. So there will be power structures between the two, right?
There will be. Well, there are. Let's put it this way. I mean, but again, in terms of thinking about the needs that are governing infants' social psychology and social group cognition, I think, again, the basic need is to find out who my group is. And in that sense, not worrying too much, in a sense. I mean, not even thinking so much about the existence of outgroups. I mean, I need to form, I mean, we can call it a group. I mean, I need to figure out who are the people that I can trust. And even think about this sort of as I think logically, sort of in the context of getting in touch with another group, sort of to fulfill need number one, or even to fulfill dominance. If I don't have a group that I can trust, I'm never going to go into a conflict with another group. I'm not going to go as an individual. I need to have a group. So I would say that even logically, I mean, I first need to have a sense that I have a coherent group that is really with me, that I can trust. And then perhaps I can entertain the possibility of trying to dominate another group or to trying to compete with another group. So I think even logically, I think the sequence needs to come first from affiliating, forming a cohesive group, and then perhaps expanding or standing up to others.
Okay. And I have just one more question along that, is on the same slide actually. Is there a gender bias, or I mean, like, and I'm just wondering if you've even read about it anywhere, maybe not even in children, but even among adults, is this, do women tend to go towards affiliation or conflict, or do men tend to go, does the bias, what is the main motivator to form groups between men and women? Is it conflict or affiliation between the two needs? I was wondering if there's anything you know that's out there that may have a gender lens.
There is something out there, something that I put out there. I can send it to you. And it's so crazy that I sometimes I don't present it. But let me go here. And the second point here, this behaviorally priming affiliation lessens racial categorization. I'll tell you, this is not a complete statement. Behaviorally priming conflict. Sorry, I'll take a step back and say answer your question straight. I have evidence, yes, that conflict is a stronger trigger for categorization, for social categorization in infants when the targets are men than when the targets are women. And collaboration is a stronger trigger for social categorization when the targets are women than when the targets are men. And I can definitely send this paper to you, to Sid, or I don't know, you can look it up. I mean, the first author is Ferreira, and it's 2018 in Evolution and Human Behavior. But again, this is my work done with infants, but others have done also work on adults. So I drew that hypothesis from their work, and their work is that yes, I mean, for men there is more of a conflict motivation than for women, and for women more of an affiliation motivation.
I would have, I know this is a little contrary, but I was just wondering why then there are boys clubs, which is like so prevalent in the industrialized world, but there are not as many women's clubs. And so I actually thought that maybe at some point of time, women tend to move towards conflict and men tend to move towards affiliation in terms of power. This is what I thought, but I'm not sure about it. In terms of maybe if it's not a power-driven thing, maybe they choose differently. But this is a completely random assumption. But just because of the fact that there are so many male clubs, and if you like work in the corporate world, this is something everybody knows. The men get together, they kind of promote their own kind, whereas among the women, there's not very strong support systems for each other. That's even there on the domestic front. You actually see it quite a bit.
Yeah.
So I kind of thought that maybe there would be some research that would tell us if there is a power structure or something that will cause women, instead of collaborating, but to move into conflict kind of things. But
Yeah.
I'm happy to read
Yeah.
what you sent me, because that will help me think this through better.
Okay, sure. And again, there's work by on social dominance orientation by Jim C. Daniels, who also talks about exactly this sort of gender differences, and I think probably also mentioning the differences that you talked about. And again, I mean, I would say that these boys clubs, I don't know what again in India, but you can say again that it's affiliation for the sake of competition, and that's again sort of the logical step that I say again. If I want to compete, I mean, I better associate myself with a powerful and big enough group so that I can then trump whoever comes along. So the ultimate goal is the competition, and I understand that I need the group to be successful.
Yes, that's within that's what I say. The power, it'll strengthen the ties within the in-group, but you want to keep the out-group closer to you. So there's distance doesn't come. That was my question. Definitely you will keep but you will also keep the opposite group close to you, because you need them to dominate over. So distance only will come when there's fear, I think, not otherwise. Otherwise you need them around. And which is why also I think between the Nazis and the Jewish people, what happened during the Holocaust is that they feared Jews. And I think that's why they may probably try to eliminate them, because there was fear. Fear is when you want to get rid of them. If you're not afraid and you want to just dominate them, then you keep them close, you keep them around, you keep them as slaves. Or I'm stretching over. I stop right now. I'll let that stop. Sorry. That was a wonderful talk. Thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you for the questions.
We have several comments in the chat.
I can see them now. Should I?
If you have any comments to in response, that feel free. You're more than welcome to.
Let me see.
So I had a question, Rachel.
Sure.
Can I ask now, or I can wait if I don't know how to raise hand here, and that's the problem.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Okay, just a simple question. Great presentation. Thank you so much. I was able to join a little later, but a very interesting presentation. This alignment because of goals has been studied in different types of literature, I suppose. The question is, what I have seen and read is that alignment can be temporary, right? And so the behavior, as long as people understand that there is a goal to be achieved, they might work together to achieve the goal. But does it really mean that the differences come down? Maybe over time, if the same group kind of does the same thing, maybe even with different goals, they might. But if the group changes and the goals change, then does the inherent conflict or differences really go away? And how do we even study that? Because that will require a long-term study, basically, right? So I wondered whether they will really go away, although there are studies, no doubt. In fact, in corporations, there is a strong bond between people within group bonds is quite strong. And they even kind of talk about the other competing groups as outgroups a lot. But you can just change the context, even go home and with them, and then that affiliation isn't really there. So something else takes over, right? So we kind of change affiliations a lot. That is what I have understood, although I've not read papers on changing goal affiliations yet, but maybe you may have. That was one general question. The other very small one was, we have conflict and affiliation, right? Is there another group which says, I don't care group, right? And I wonder if a lot of people actually just belong to that, because there can be clubs based on that, or God knows what, but does it have to be these two? That's my point. Can there be something in between? And have you had a chance to think about it? That's all. Thank you.
Well, I'll answer the second question first, and then I hope I remember the first one. So the second question, the two needs that I pointed out there, I mean, I think, again, they are drawn from sort of evolutionary psychology, and definitely, I mean, we like anything that we may have inherited from our ancestral brains, we each individual may have it sort of active in us to different extents. And as I noted in one of sort of my final slides, you know, I say we all have self-regulatory capacities. We can all inhibit whatever dispositions we may be born with in all kinds of ways, right? I mean, so I would say sort of the simple answer is that yes, I mean, people may be more or less driven by these different needs. Yeah, for sure, definitely. It doesn't deny the fact that, again, I mean, that if we go young, if we go to infants, we may see evidence of these two dispositions already there. But again, even among infants, like anything, we may find individual differences, and for sure, once infants grow, and children and adults and adolescents and so on, then these differences may become even more exacerbated, and again, find huge differences in how potent these needs are. Now, going back to your first question about the sort of the flexibility or the stability of groups defined arbitrarily based on common goals, I agree with you. I mean, and again, the example that I gave in the end, you know, about the cricket teams and the cricket national team, I know it's a little facile, it's a little, you may call it a cheap example in a sense, and it shows really, again, a very contextual and temporary abandonment of my tribal associations with my cricket team. And again, we're talking about cricket and not about, I don't know, world politics and so on, and other major conflicts. So the idea then is that it's possible. So it's a proof of concept in a sense that example, and the example perhaps that you gave also sort of about organizations and people then, I don't know, having a drink together, you know, after work, even with your competitors, or even, I don't know, within other departments within the organization. But I think it's a proof of concept that says that if many other changes happen within the organization or within a society, you can redraw the lines. But I agree with you that these really need to be, they require major changes. They require structural changes. I mean, I'll give the example, again, going back to that school in which Jewish and Arab children learn together for many, many years. What I haven't done, and I have, I don't know, I have dreamed of doing, and there were attempts doing it and so on, was to follow up these kids 10 years after they're done with school. What happened to them? That is, what happened after they have finished and perhaps they have left after elementary school, so at age 12, let's say, and then they went to high schools that were again segregated. So Jewish kids went to a Jewish high school, Arab kids went to an Arab high school. What happens to these kids when they hit 18, when they hit 20 or something like that? Is there something that, is there really something that stays there with them for the rest of their lives, or the exposure again to the segregated and the mainstream societies and narratives and media erase all the work or erase a lot of the work done in those, I don't know, 6, 7, 8 years in which they lived in integrated environments? I don't know. I mean, I think again, I think yes, society, and especially in Israel, is such a divisive society. Stereotyping and there's a lot of, again, ideologies against the integration, that it is possible that unfortunately after a few years of, again, living back in your regular societies, in your regular cities and schools and so on, all that is undone. So it's a long answer, I mean, to your question that says that unfortunately, I think yes, I mean, it does require a lot of sustained structural changes for these redrawing and redefinition and reconceptualization of the social groups. But I think it can be done. And I think, as you're right, I mean, we would need sort of historical studies. But there's some, again, I'm not an expert here, but in the history of social groups, unfortunately. But even one example that is often mentioned is regarding Jews in the United States. So Jews in the United States back in the early 20th century were seen as a race, not that differently than African Americans or blacks are seen nowadays in the United States, or even not that different from Nazi Germany conceptions of what Jews are. They're physiologically different, they have different inclinations, different dispositions, and so on. And that, of course, has changed in 100 years. And it has changed by, again, a redefinition of that group and an integration of that group into mainstream society, so that nowadays, you know, Jews don't even have a box in their college applications, you know, when they ask, you know, people, you know, what your, I don't know, what your social group is. I mean, I don't think there's a box even to check that you're Jewish, because you're just white, right? I mean, it has become, Jews have become white. They weren't white 100 years ago. So that's, again, I think sort of a change that was, again, maintained by structural changes, narrative changes. Probably the war and the Holocaust contributed also to this change. But anyway, it's doable.
Thank you so much.
I have a small question kind of relating to these structural changes. Have you any experience with media narratives normalizing stereotypes and how it affects development? Or do you have any ideas of who you would recommend looking at their work?
Sorry, did you ask media outlets?
Media, like any kind of media narratives that I mean, I've done a lot of work in media and gender, but this kind of group mentality that is reinforced by structural divides is often also visible in media narratives, right? So if there's like when I was doing my master's, I was really looking into media and gender stereotypes and its effect on developmental psychology. But I wasn't necessarily satisfied with any of the studies. So I was just curious if you have any suggestions or not so much. Okay, no problem.
Yeah, no, I mean, unfortunately, I mean, first of all, you're absolutely right. I mean, that media has a huge impact, on children and youth. But I don't know of any systematic studies.
That's fine. I was just curious. Your research is really fascinating, so I was hoping for somebody who was working in your style.
Yeah, I'm starting that.
Hi, I just have a quick question. Hi, I'm Sophia. I'm working for the Center for Women's Empowerment and Gender Equality, and I'm a faculty also for the social work program, Master of Social Work, and I'm doing research. And I was wondering about the integration in the schools. I think that's really great that you can actually reduce the discrimination by integrating Jews and Arabs in the schools. Because, like, for example, in the US, you have the African Americans and the European Americans in the same school system. Still, there's discrimination. In Germany, you have immigrants and non-immigrants in the school system. There's discrimination. In India, you have the different castes in the same school system. There's discrimination. So, how do these schools actually manage to integrate Jews and Arabs?
So yeah, so as I said, I think in response to Sid's question, in Israel also there are a few schools in certain more mixed cities, such as Jaffa and Haifa, in which there are Jewish and Arab kids attending the same school and the same classes. The thing is, in these schools, for instance, that the ones that I'm mentioning now, not the ones that I studied, in these schools, the curriculum is the Jewish curriculum. The language is Hebrew. And going back now to the discussion with Bhavani, there's a clear dominance hierarchy there. I mean, it is the Jewish narrative. It is a Jewish school, so Jews are the majority, sort of in numbers as well. So there's a clear dominance hierarchies. And when you have that, and I think that may be the case also in many other places like the ones that you mentioned now, I mean, just sort of regular public schools in the United States, in India, in Germany, that's not an environment that is necessarily going to diminish discrimination, stereotype, and prejudice. The environment that I studied, the schools that I studied, are schools that, as I pointed out, they are sort of, they shot for the ideal integration, so that the curriculum is a mixed curriculum or a balanced curriculum. The children have to learn both languages. Half of the day is in Hebrew, half of the day is in Arabic, half of the day is with a Jewish teacher, half of the day is with an Arab teacher. They learn about the customs of both places. So there's really a flattening of the hierarchy. And unfortunately, and this is in response to, I think, the question of Vivek, it is an artificial flattening of the hierarchy, because once kids step outside, the hierarchy is there. Jews are the majority in terms of numbers. Jews are the dominant force in terms of media, for instance. And the language is, so there's a clear asymmetry, right? I mean, so many more Arabs speak Hebrew than Jews who speak Arabic. So, so I think that the differences, sort of going back to your question, Sophia, have to do with this. I mean, this is really what kind of integrated environment you create. And then, unfortunately, this is going back to Vivek's question, how can you ascertain, ensure that some of the messages of that ideal environment spread outside of the school, spread outside of that particular environment, and the child or the young person or the adult still has something in them, the capacity to, despite the inequality that exists outside, maintain that vision, that view that they have hopefully acquired within that very, again, protective and bubble-like environment. So, yeah, I don't have any magical tricks, I think, for doing that, unfortunately.
Thank you.
Gil, two quick things. You mentioned our past as human beings. So it's about 200,000, more or less, years that human beings exist. For about 80–90% of our lives, our existence as human beings, we were hunters and gatherers. There are still hunters and gatherers around the globe, and there's been research on the hunters and gatherers in Africa and in your former home country, Brazil. And researchers have gotten together to see what's common to modern hunters and gatherers. Now, it's not hunters and gatherers as they were, let's say, 100,000 years ago. They're exposed to the West now. They're exposed to the East. They're exposed. But one of the things that's found is what the commonalities were among the hunters and gatherers in these various locations and countries is a deep commonality. One of them is that essential to the group is sharing. Another is equality. There is hardly, and I'm just saying hardly to hedge my bets, there's hardly any leadership. There is, thank goodness, no Bibi Netanyahu in any of these groups. The groups are about 25 to 35 people. And there is nobody who says we should do this, we should do that, and everybody follows, or some people follow. It's egalitarian. It is not, it's also autonomous. People have the right to do what they want to do, and you protect that autonomy. You don't tell people what to do. And unlike what many people think, there's very little violence in modern hunter and gatherer, small scale societies. So when you had mentioned that before about it, this is something which I know a little bit about from discussions and readings. So there's that. One quick thing. In schools that are integrated in Israel, where people come in ideologically and they want to have the integration, both the Arabs and the Jews, and they're predisposed to have discussions at home about integration, about how we are in some ways all the same, and in other ways we are different, culturally different, and we're also different just as human beings. I know of one school that's like that, and apparently, and what I'm going to tell you is something that has happened more than once, and I don't know if it's only in that school or if it's in other schools. When the children get to high school age, in Israel, there is a matriculation examination, which unfortunately determines a huge amount about your future, if you're going to be at a university, etc. And people leave, the Jews leave the school, the integrated schools, to get to the Jewish schools and high schools, so that their kids will be better prepared for the matriculation examination, which means on the part of the Arabs, we're not good enough intellectually. So everything was fine until there was something important happening now. And that is, it's no longer all of us together, but it's we, as Jews, want to have a better intellectual education for our kids. And we'll put the social side off to the side on the back burner.
Yeah. Well, I'll just tell you about the second part. I mean, I don't know exactly how to respond to the first part, Sid. But the second part, you're absolutely right. And by the way, I mean, from what I understand, even the initial motivation to enroll their children into these integrated schools, Jews and Arabs differ. Jewish parents are more likely to be interested in enrolling their children into these integrated schools for these ideological reasons, for getting to know the other, so to speak, and having exposure to their culture and their language and so on. Whereas Arab parents are more likely, I mean, again, I don't think if this is the main motivation, but nevertheless, they're more likely than the Jewish parents to be interested in enrolling their children into these integrated schools just for the academic, so that they want their kids to learn Hebrew, because they understand that knowing Hebrew at a native tongue level is going to be hugely beneficial for them in Israeli society. So not so much, again, for the ideology of getting to know the other, or less so again. I mean, again, I think they are also interested in the ideology. But as I'm saying, so just the relative weights of these two main motivations, the academic motivation versus the ideological motivation, I think there are disparities already in the beginning. And then, as you said, I mean, towards the end of the schooling system, yes, these schools indeed suffer from many of the Jewish children leaving these schools to go to these. But here, I mean, I don't know if I disagree with you, but I think the argument is not so much about that being with the Arabs is not going to be good for you academically, but just that there are better high schools in general than this particular high school. So, and some of these high schools. So, for instance, there's a very prestigious high school next to the Hebrew University in Jerusalem called Liyada, right? So many parents, and it's also sort of a liberal arts, and there's music, but it's also a very, very good high school. So if a child, if a Jewish child can sort of get accepted into their high school, the Jewish Israeli parent may say, well, yeah, you better go there. And yes, it was nice that you got to know some Arab and some Arabic culture, but now it's time to get real, and this is a better school, period. So go there. So I think, yeah, and as I said, that's one of the reasons, and I had the whole design, and I thought that we could be able to do it, but then for all kinds of reasons, we ended up not being able to roll out this study, is to really go to that high school and then test the Jewish kids who are there in high school, but were in the integrated schools in elementary school, and see what's going on with them in terms of their attitudes and beliefs and so on. I think it's still a study that can be done, but anyway.
Gil, you've been more than generous with your time.
That's because I thought that we were starting in an hour, so.
Oh, we could go on much longer then.
No, fine.
So thank you for a really interesting talk. Everybody knows what you're talking about in terms of in and out and others and us and them, and giving labels to them and to us, etc. So we've all experienced that either as in the in-group or the out-group, you and I experienced both. So when you were in Brazil and I was in the United States, we were the out-group. And then we came to Israel and we became the in-group, which is quite a transformation in understanding about yourself and your identity. So we all are aware of it at a certain level. My guess is that most people who are listening in and writing their comments haven't thought about the kind of categories that you talked about, the understandings that social scientists, that people in cognitive development and social development, social cognitive development, how they understand this. And in that sense, I'm certain it was enlightening for all of us, including for people who know somebody. So thank you for sharing the ideas with us. Thank you for being so very clear about an area which is not all that clear. And it's also an area that has quite a bit of emotions attached to it in all kinds of directions, from the ins, from the outs, from the people who are out who want in and the ins who want out and all of that. And you're being labeled, you're being told who you are by other people, even though you thought you were just Gil Diesendruck and I thought I was Sidney Strauss, and yeah, I'm Jewish. But that's part of my definition. But I'm also a person who does whatever it is he does and thinks about. And I'm sure you might have had similar kinds of feelings. So, and this gets to, and with this I am, this gets to women empowerment, which is part of what Bhavani had asked, and gender equality, which is the big divide between men and women, and a few categories in between. Now there's a long alphabet that I never can remember. And then how do you level, as you said, how do you level it so that you don't have the hills and the peaks and the valleys where people come in already knowing something about you without having ever met you in their lives. And so what you talked about touches on some very important aspects of what it is that's being done at AMMACHI University in the AMMACHI Labs and the center I just mentioned. And for this, and for your enlightening us and giving such an edifying talk, you really have our deep appreciation. And I know that I'm speaking on behalf of everybody. It's just not me. It is certainly me, but I know it's all of us from comments that were going on back and forth. So thank you. When the time comes, and you'd be interested whether the corona is under control, and you would want to come to India, I think you would find it fascinating. Fascinating because it's fascinating, and there's something really very different than what it is that you and I are familiar with. And there are huge issues that you brought up that are in India with a Hindi overlay and with an Eastern philosophy overlay, which is quite different than what it is that people in the West, you and I and others, are familiar with. So I'm extending on behalf of all of us an invitation to come, to see, and to work together on whatever it is that people would want to do and you would want to do. So thank you again. That's why I said, yeah, that's why I said our field is in good hands. You hear Gil, and you know that it's really in good hands, intellectually and emotionally. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Sid. Thank you for the words. Thank you for the invitation, and maybe I'll take you up on the visit to India and to AMMACHI Labs. It would be a pleasure indeed.
Right.
Thank you so
Inshallah.
much.
Thank you all for the questions.
The pleasure will be ours. Look forward to it. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for this wonderful talk. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Gil.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.